Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Doing good.
Yep. You making it?
Yeah. Pretty good.
Did you say something, Christina? Because your mouth moved.
Oh, I was coughing. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. But I was like,
And I'm eating.
your mouth moved, but I can't hear. And it was. You know, you never think about like what becomes a normal, and so I think it's one of these times where it feels like this is becoming the new normal, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm starting to get used to it, and you're like, I'm not okay with this though. I don't want this to be the normal, right? Like I want this to be this unprecedented time, and then we move on to something else. I see you, Tom. Give everybody a few more minutes to get on. Well, they have a minute before class starts anyway. But who's Cheeto? Anybody gonna take claim to that? I see. Thank you. How are your other classes going? Anybody?
My language classes are really weird and annoying now because they're each only 50 minutes, so we don't actually speak any German at all whatsoever.
That's
Yeah.
nice. Like I'm here to learn a language, and you know, then that's kind of rough.
Yeah, it's a little bit frustrating. Also, I presented last night at AREC, and that was very like slapdash put together. Apparently, half of the kids that presented didn't even know that we presented twice or have a second time for their second panel. So like everyone just got off, and I was like lucky enough that one of my people got on while I was waiting after my first panel, and they were like, yeah, you don't start until 7:05, and I was like, had no idea. And that was apparently the case for like over a half of the people that were presenting.
Yeah, I think it's probably rough to like try to organize lots of people like this because because in general, like in person, you know, like you run around and you say things or you have this body language, and I think that's one of the harder parts that I'm finding from teaching everybody is none of you use your cameras, which is, you know, fine or whatever, but like I don't get I get immediate feedback in class. Like I get like your nonverbal cues, and I don't get those here. I mean, I get whatever cues, like thankfully Christine and Mary Lynn are always usually pretty good about showing me their face, so I get like their facial cues, but that means that like I can't know the rest of the class, you know, if you know, whatever Mary Lynn gets doesn't mean that everybody, you know, or the, you know, vice versa. And so it's always a little bit interesting to figure things out this way. I saw that this morning that I'm just giving everybody one last minute to come on. I saw this morning that the Supreme Court is going to start hearing testimony via electronically, and it was just like because they haven't done that before, and it's just like, you know, everybody's kind of just being affected by it, because I imagine that's also another case where you get a lot of especially in commentating on the Supreme Court and whether how they are making decisions, like you get a lot of feedback from them and like what they look like while they're deliberating, and so then people aren't going to have that, they're just going to get some kind of final ruling. Anyways, so yeah, welcome to class. It's day 555 of the COVID quarantine. I hope you're doing all okay. And you know, I don't think Kayla lives down in Chattanooga, and I know that her community was affected by some tornadoes. But I hope all of you, you know, didn't have any issues with the big storms that came through. And if you did, you know, you need to work on timing things. Anyways, be safe. That's the moral of this. Be safe and healthy, whatever you're doing. I don't remember if we had any housekeeping things to talk about. Like, I gave you your papers, or I didn't give you any feedback. I read your papers a while ago. We have, you didn't have anything due to me today, right? No, right? Okay, thanks. I was like, I don't think so. In my other class, I've been trying to keep up with, I had to talk to y'all about some stuff. I think, no, I don't think we have anything. If anybody has any like housekeeping stuff, let me know now, but I don't think I have anything. We're still trucking along. I probably need to give you some kind of another assignment here just for homeworky stuff, but I also don't like the idea of just giving you busy work. I feel like you're busy enough with all the other running behind everybody else. And so I'll figure something out. And then, yeah, I had a question that I was going to pose to the class, but I think I'm going to make it an exam question. So I can't give that to you. Anyways, I don't remember where we started last class because I don't ever remember. I don't like mark it. I know we ended on pros and cons of free trade. Did we just start talking about the multilateral trade agreements somewhere around in there?
That's where we started.
Okay, perfect. So we talked about the different classifications of trade agreements. Can somebody give me what one of the trade agreements are, or like the different classifications? They're all trade agreements of some sort.
You mean free trade area?
Yeah, that's it. Totally. Thank you, Sahid. That's an example of a trade agreement. Do you want to tell us what a free trade area is?
I mean, a group of countries that abolish trade restrictions between members, but are allowed own trade policy to outside countries.
Yeah. So if we're going to think about this as some kind of scale of the most restrictive to the least restrictive, free trade areas are the least restrictive, right? They're the ones that say, hey, between two countries, we're going to have some kind of agreement, and we are going to agree what's going to have some kind of trade restrictions reduction between us, but you do whatever you want with everybody else, right? What's another type of trade agreement classification?
Customs union.
Customs unions, yeah, thank you. This is where basically it's just the next step on that, where we say we also create common policies with other countries. So we're still saying we're going to have some agreement between us, right? We're just building on free trade areas, but now we're also going to have some kind of consistent way we treat everybody else. I suppose somebody's going to give me the next one, but what's the next one, guys? For girls, gals, people, humans.
A common market.
Yeah, a common market. There's not a lot of examples of common markets because most of the common markets have shifted into final one, which we'll talk about in a second. But a common market is we use the custom unions, but we build up that we allow this free movement of factors of production. So that means we allow for people to move across borders. They don't need to have some kind of visa stamp. They don't need anything else. It also means money can move across borders. Typically unification of agreements of these factors of production. The European Union or the predecessor to the European Union, which was the European Economic Community, is a major example that people always give for the common markets. There are other ones, but I don't have other examples. It's pretty rare because typically people move into the final one, which is what is our final type of classification?
Economic union.
Economic union, right? This is where we had the European Union, where now we have this unification of internal trade. We have a unification of external trade. And then we also have this a consistent monetary and fiscal policy, right? So this is the same argument that happened to the US when we became the United States, right? And we became a union, which is also an argument for like that historically we've gone over with like states' rights versus federal rights. And the same thing happens to the European Union. It comes into these individual countries and their rights versus the rights of the European Union versus how we're going to do these monetary and fiscal policies. So we talked about these different types of trade agreements. And then, so think about like your countries and the different trade agreements they have with other people. And we might think that oftentimes we think about these in terms of free trade agreements or regional trade agreements. So we think of TPP, those are just free trade areas where we're having some kind of agreement internally. Very rarely you're going to kind of extend past that, but you can. And then we talked about some pros and cons of free trade. I'm not going to go over that because that was a long discussion. But we talked about, you know, just that there are these pros and the cons of free trade. And that there's always going to be people who have ideological ideas about whether we should have free trade or not have free trade. And free trade isn't the perfect answer. And I think I ended on a quote. We didn't get into currency exchange markets, did we? No, I thought that was what we were going to start today. I was making sure. But what we have is this. I ended on this kind of quote by, and I don't even think I wrote who wrote it, but it's free trade is maybe not always technically optimal. There might be failures of free trade, right? Like free trade can harm countries. It can harm low-income countries, encourages urbanization, potentially does impact the environment and kind of all of these other issues. It can have problems, right? But oftentimes it's pragmatically optimal. That oftentimes what we have is we have this pragmatically optimal solution that, given that there's no other solutions, this is the better option, because it allows for the and think back to our example earlier in the semester when we talked about comparative advantage and we drew the graphs and we showed that with trade, both countries were better off because they were able to trade with that which they were comparatively better at producing versus having to produce all of the things internally. And so this is maybe some of those arguments about, you know, there's a little bit of this, you know, historically there's this rise of nationalism or populism. And it says, hey, you know, why we got to produce everything domestically. And you could argue for, you know, keeping labor in, we could argue for money and all these other things. But one of the arguments you should make, right, or you should at least have in your wheelhouse to make is, hey, we can want to produce things in the States. We can have nationally protected goods. We can do all of these other things. But there is a way in which we should produce, which we're comparatively advantageous at producing, and that makes everybody better off. So even if we're not producing all of the goods that we used to produce, we're producing other things, right? Like we didn't stop producing. The U.S. didn't stop producing when we moved manufacturing out of the U.S. We just started producing other things, right, and other types of goods. But then again, that kind of shakes us at our core about, you know, what are we going to be? Are we going to be manufacturing? And then that also ties back into the other part of your class where we talked about capital and labor intensive, right? And we talked about producing that which you're intensive in. Is the U.S. a capital or a labor intensive country?
Capital.
Yeah, the U.S. is a capital intensive country. We have exceptionally more capital than we do labor in relative to most other countries. And so arguably we produce more capital intensive goods. And if, you know, one of the arguments people make is, well, why don't we just move back to labor? And you think about it this way, like how many farmers out there do you know are hiring hundreds of people to go, you know, to go harvest their soybeans? Does anybody know? Somebody doesn't know why I'm going on. You know, how many people have you know, hundreds of, you know, nobody's doing that. We all have really big tractors and we do things because we're capital intensive, and that's kind of where that looks at. Okay, so we are moving into today, I know I need to share my screen, currency exchange markets. And, oh, no. Sorry, it was weird for a second and it was not gonna let me do it. Not okay with that. You see it all right? Okay, making sure.
Yes.
Perfect. So, oops. So we're going to talk about currency exchange markets. So currency exchange markets is this, it allows, so currency exchange markets. So when we think about individual countries have a currency, right? Like or they use other countries' currencies. So I think like for a while, and I'm not sure if they still do, but Ecuador used to use the US dollar, right? Like, so you can choose to use somebody else's currency and that's fine. But if you have an individual currency, we now have this global world where we're trading goods and we're exchanging products. And so we have to do that with some kind of unification of our currency. I can't say I'm going to buy your things using US dollars and if you don't use the US dollar, because now you have to have some kind of exchange. And so the idea is these markets started coming up, and they have historically always been there. These markets come up that allow to decrease the barriers of financial transactions, right? So we allow this globalization to happen because now we can facilitate international trade through currency exchange. And so it's the market for currency here, the market for currency is like any other good. And I mean that we have a supply and demand for currency, right? So the market for currency is like any other good, and we think about it like any other good. So there's a demand for a good, and when that demand, so let's think about this. Somebody wants to help me out. So if the demand, as an example, the demand increases for currency, what do you think happens to the value of that currency?
The value increased too.
Yeah, it's going to increase too, right? Because what we see is it's the same thing we talk about in any other good when we have prices, right? When the demand for a good goes up, the price for that good typically goes up as well, right? Assuming that we have some kind of constant supply. So let's assume that we have some kind of constant supply. As the demand goes up, that means there's become scarce, right? Which means the value is going to go up. So, in toilet paper, the value of toilet paper just went up. People started, or what was the hand sanitizer stuff, and somebody was trying to gouge the market with them, right? It was the demand for it, so the value goes up. And so currencies are the same ways. So if we have that as an example, and then here's another thing is, as supply increases, what happens to its value? Yeah, I see Nathan's hand. Value decreases. Oh, I open my little chatty box here too. Chat. Thank you, Riley. So yes, as supply increases, the value is going to decrease, which makes sense, right? So this is part of the idea, is that you can't just print money to make it more valuable. So I've seen it on Facebook before. It's like, we just print some more money and we'll be kings of the world. You can't print money to make it more valuable, right? Because what happens is, as there's more of it, that means it's easier to get, right? Like, how many of you are going to go buy, I don't even got to think of a silly example right now. As there's more of it, you're just not going to pay as much for it because you're just going to go to another marketer to sell it, to buy something, right? It's kind of like somebody trying to sell you that orange Coke that they were giving out on campus. Nobody was going to go buy it, right? You're just going to go to somebody else who's going to give it out for free. And so this is kind of idea, and same thing with currencies. And so this kind of idea that you just print more to make it worth more, it doesn't, which is part of also the reason why we have to be careful with how much money you have on the market, and depending on supply and demand. So we're going to go through an example super briefly.
Thompson, may I ask a question?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think in the case of the US is different, because for example, in my country, if we print a lot of pesos, a part of Colombia, nobody wants that pesos, right? The Colombian pesos. But the US, everybody wants dollars. If I take those dollars to, I don't know, in Japan, China, and those dollars has value there. So there is like a special process of policy here in the US to print money. Because I think the US wants dollars.
So it cut out for just a second, but I think you're arguing about like the spatial component, like the spatial domain. And the argument, I think, goes back to, it's the total demand and supply for money. So it's not just internal demand, right? It's also external demand. So to your point that when I was in Korea, I could use at the airport, I could use my US dollars to pay for things at the airport that I didn't have to have Korean dollars or Korean, I don't know the units. And so your Colombian pesos have a value. It's just a lot less demanded externally to Colombia than maybe the US dollar is, right? And I think that's what you're trying to say.
It just isn't, maybe it's not something related with the topic we are seeing. It's just like I am curious how this process works. So why the US, or I don't know, which is the reference point to print money in the US, like how many money US can print.
So I'm going to answer, I'm going to take this in two different ways. So one is, the question is, what's a reference? So one is that we are making our decision based on total demand for dollars. So it's not total demand internal. So it's not total demand from, if every American needs so many dollars, it's how much demand is globally demanded for the entire unit. And so if all of a sudden there's if China is buying up a whole bunch of dollars, we might be inclined to print more because there's, for some reason we might want to have the demand. So we want to increase, the value is going up. And so we're going to maybe print more. So we take into account for the whole amount. And then, what was the second part of that? You asked who's going to print and what's the decision to print money. I think, I had two thoughts and one of them's gone. I think we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And if we don't, you want to hit me back up to follow up with whatever questions you're asking on more?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. So, and I don't think we're going to totally hit, this is not a monetary policy class, so I'm not going to go into super details about the decision to print money, but I do want to talk about kind of how it relates to, we're talking about money as it relates to trade, and we're talking about this idea of people they're like, oh, just print money and then we'll just all be rich. Or how do we affect through valuation and devaluation of currency, and whether that's good or bad inherently. And so I wanted to talk about, it's kind of the prime example, which is sad for them. And my friend from Zimbabwe, we talked about this a lot. But they went through a period of hyperinflation. So we all kind of maybe have heard of inflation, and this is, the US's typical growth rate of inflation is 3% roughly. And that's just the change in the value of money, or the devaluation or inflationary value. You need 3% more dollars in order to get the same amount of things that you had before. In Zimbabwe, starting 2008, it had a peak inflation. So let me just go through this example. Zimbabwe had a monthly inflation rate and let's say this is in 2008. So just make sure that we have some kind of date here. Does anybody want to guess what percentage? So yeah, actually, somebody, if you want to chat me really quick, tell me what you think their percent month-to-month inflation rate was. I have two. I need something from everybody.
I think some years back, it was around 20%, but I don't know what is it now.
Okay. That everybody, I think Ethan, you haven't responded. Everybody think, or Justin, did you respond? Justin, you also have not responded, just saying. Or Alexis, no, Alexis did. Okay, well, I'm at a point I got to stop. But just for reference, Ethan and Justin, I would still like to see an answer over there. It's part of class participation. Part of me was like, this is a quiz. If you don't do this, like, you don't, but I'm not actually giving you points yet. get 20 seconds more. Oh man, Ethan, computer timed out. That's rough. I don't know what that means. Like you only get so much time on a computer. Either it'll work. Well, the question, Ethan, is what percentage? Oh, bad Wi-Fi. I'm sorry, man. It's what percentage of inflation rate month to month do you think happened for Zimbabwe? And see everybody's guess. You're just guessing. Crazy numbers. Ooh, what a day. Thanks, Ethan. Still Justin. No, you, man. I'm just saying. Make a note.
Wait, sorry, what are we doing? Sorry, I was on a phone call.
You're on another call. Thanks.
Someone called me.
Getting coffee. I'm sorry, it's also you. You're writing a. I just don't know what happens. I can't hear anything. We are writing what you project that Zimbabwe's month-to-month inflation rate was in 2008.
1,200%.
1,200%. You are the highest right now, right? Because Nathan was 1,000%. Thank you for answering, Justin. Nathan was 1,000%. You were. This is like Price is Right, and whoever came closest to it without going over wins. You are correct, but you're off by like a million percentage. So it was month to month inflation rate in 2008 was 79.6 billion%. 79.6 billion%. I can't fathom how large of an inflation rate that is and how big that exists on a year-to-year inflation rate. I'm not going to make you go through this whole example again. It was 89.7 sextillion%. November 2008 to November 2007, it was 89.7 sextillion%. Again, cannot fathom the scale of how large of a percentage of inflation that was. And part of this was it was this. I mean, one, it's called hyperinflation, and what it is it's you basically are on this track of continuously we got to print money to make it worth more, and so then they just kept printing money. And then it kept being worth less because there's more and more of it. So each individual dollar is worth less now. So you can't purchase as many goods. So they blamed, and I'm going to go through a series of hyperinflation, but I'm going to give an example. So an example of this would be every day you would have to wake up and there would be this board and it would tell you how many Zimbabwean dollars it would cost you to buy a loaf of bread. And so one day it was, $2. And the next day it was $10. And the next day it was $1,000. And then the next day you needed 1 million Zimbabwean dollars in order to get a loaf of bread, right? And so the idea that they were printing these, $1 million notes so that people could go buy bread. And you're like, okay, well at that point, it's not worth $1 million. This is worth a penny, right? I need 60 of these in order to buy a loaf of bread. This is not worth $1 million. So this kind of perception, it literally became, the money became so worthless. People used it as toilet paper. And I don't mean that as joking around. Literally it just became paper and it became so useless because of this hyperinflation that was happening. And so one of the arguments of Zimbabwe, so the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe used was there was these sanctions by the US, the IMF, and the European Union. And these sanctions were on that froze assets, and these visa denials targeted at these people tied to the Mugabe regime, which was the Mugabe regime was appropriating land from rich white people and giving it to blacks among a series of corrupt decisions, along with a series of corrupt decisions. So they were doing this reappropriation, which led to the collapse of the bank. So these farmers, so all of a sudden you have these people who've never farmed before on this land that is now theirs, and that they can't get operating loans. So they can't buy seeds, they can't buy anything to plant. And so now not only do you have people who've never farmed or never don't have the kind of institutional knowledge, right? But now you have people who can't have access to the funds in order to put their enterprise together. And then you also have this kind of large corruption, all these other corrupt decisions happening at the same time. And so there's restrictions placed on Zimbabwe, and literally led to them kept printing money. And this is that idea is you see on Facebook, or I don't know if you see on Facebook, I have a lot of ridiculous people on Facebook. And so every once in a while I'll see somebody's like, we'll just print the money. And you're like, that's not how this works, because what you end up with is, what you end up with is this is hyperinflation. And so the idea is there is a balance between printing of money and the value of money, and understanding that as you print more, you're devaluing your dollar, or devaluing your currency unit, right? Or whatever we want to call it. And so, but it also, the flip side of that is not that if I don't print enough, if we say, well, we don't print any money, so we appreciate, and sometimes you want to have devalued currency. I know, surprise. And so, let's talk about it, like in exchange for a good. I think we all know kind of what exchange rates are, but let's talk about those exchange rates. So we talked about, I wanted to give you Zimbabwe as an example. I know I'm just jumping back up. I want to give you Zimbabwe as an example of how this appreciation and depreciation of currency, and this idea that like, oh, just print money, doesn't necessarily work. And now we're going to go through currency exchange, and we're going to go through devaluation and appreciation of currencies super briefly, because this is not a monetary policy class, to get into how we might have addressed it, or why maybe, inflation isn't a bad thing, but maybe we want to make sure that we don't get to a point of hyperinflation. So exchange rates is the idea of the value of a currency in terms of another currency. And I didn't look up the current one. So an example of this that we think about, just because I think examples are helpful, is at the time when I wrote these notes, a euro was worth $1.12 in US dollars. I think at the time of when I wrote this, again, one Mexican peso was worth 0.5 cents US dollar. Oh, dang it. Whoops. US dollars. Omar, do you know what your peso is to dollars?
I know that $1 is worth now is 3,800 pesos. $1.
Yeah, $1 US to equals 300 pesos for Colombia.
Yes.
So again, it's just one currency in terms of another currency, right? And so, and it doesn't necessarily mean like the scale of things doesn't have to. I think sometimes they're like, oh, if it's there's also relation to the scale of purchasing power, and so it might be that like I can't remember where I was. Oh, Dios míos, where was I? Oh, in Thailand, and it was I took $100 US dollars out, and I don't remember how many thousands of Thai baht I got, but like a candy bar was 5,000 baht, right? So the scale of what I was purchasing and the scale was just shifted, right? So it wasn't that all of a sudden that I was millionaire. I mean, technically I was a million baht heir, right? But in terms of what that purchase was different. And so there's also like purchasing parity power, which we've talked a little bit about in this class before. Sahid, what currency unit do you use in Nigeria?
A dollar is 350 naira.
315?
350, 350.
350 for $1 US?
Yeah.
And what do you call your currency?
Naira.
Naira? Like NIRA?
N-A, N for nothing, A for apple, I for ink, R-A.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's almost like Narnia, and that's what I'm going to think of your currency. And I'm sorry for that. That's Narnia. Okay. So yeah, so we have these different currency exchanges, and basically these, how do we figure out what these currencies are worth, right? I mean, because that's a big question. It's like, how do we know that the euro is worth $1.12 in US dollars, right? Like that 1 euro is oh, it isn't, not okay. He's correcting me because I wrote it wrong. Yeah, I'll fix it and then we can move on. In AIRA. No. So what the deal though is, the reason is these prices come up because there is a supply and a demand, right? So it's a supply of euros in relation to the demand for in terms of US dollars, right? And so, or vice versa. And so it's these exchange rates are based on market clearing equilibrium such that currency supply equals currency demand. So when we're calculating these exchange rates, they're being created out of this kind of market demand. So it comes back to Omar's question about maybe the US dollar is used kind of globally in some places, or is demanded globally, which means that there's more demand on the US dollar than there is on the Colombian peso, right? And so it's not that the Colombian peso doesn't have value, it's that, I mean, in relation to the US dollar, it has less demand, which means it's undervalued compared to the dollar, right? So it has a lower value. And that doesn't mean that it's bad, because what it does is it relates to, and we're gonna go through that in a minute, but it relates to the ability to trade, right? Because if it's cheaper for me to buy something from you because your value is less, that means that I have incentive to purchase from you rather than to trade from me, right? So it changes the shift of these trade flows based on this current currency value. And so these dollar amounts are based on the market clearing equilibriums that are happening. So as people are demanding certain currencies, it's shifting the value related to other currencies. Which relates us to these systems. You're like, okay, well, how the heck do we know that there's these exchange systems? So let's talk about the exchange systems. There are two types of exchange systems. There is a fixed rate exchange system, and we're gonna go through this. It's too hard to like move things around, and I don't know how big my writing will be. So fixed rate exchange system is central banks determine currency price and set it at that level. So this is so we just got through saying that, hey, like market clearing equilibrium creates this exchange rate. There are some systems where people are just like that people say this is the price. Our currency is going to be worth one, so I don't think either of your Naira or pesos are fixed rate exchange, but let's say that it was 1 Brazilian real is going to be worth 50 US cents, right? That's a fixed exchange. They say this is what it is, this is how it's always going to be. The problem with that is that you don't allow this kind of movement of the markets to happen, and there's a lot of like kind of international pushback on that, because flows happen because of appreciation and depreciation of currencies. And when you don't have those flows or those money values adjusting to the market, then that kind of creates an unfair advantage for countries. And so there have been WTO rules that came out and said, hey, you can't have a fixed rate exchange system unless, and we gave exceptions to low income countries. And so we said that there are some low income countries that they just need some kind of steadiness that happens, or they need some kind of stability. And so sometimes that stability just says, hey, here's what's going to happen. And the central bank can just establish that. The most common system is going to be the second system, which is called a floating, or it also can be called a flexible rate exchange system. And that is exactly what we've talked about, which is the exchange rate is determined daily by supply and demand conditions. So fixed rate exchange says, hey, we're going to fix some exchange rate to a certain amount, and we're just going to establish that, and that's what it is. The problem with that is that it doesn't allow the kind of, in terms of how we think about markets, it's not the free market system, right? It's imposing some kind of structure on the market saying this is what it is. It is the dictatorship of currency markets, right? And the problem is that it creates unfair exchanges, right? Because it eventually there should be some kind of appreciation or depreciation of currency. Flexible exchange, floating exchange rate systems say, hey, daily there's a supply and demand conditions, and it's going to change the value back and forth, right? And it's going to depend on conditions in the market. It's going to depend on demand by everybody. So if all of a sudden some country starts demanding a currency, it's going to raise its value. But then what it does is, because my value raised, it meant your value depreciated. And so then what you're going to do is you're going to flip that script, and it's going to start purchasing the other way. When we think about, I talked a little bit in this, I think I mentioned it so many times. I think we already talked about the Chinese currency. Does anybody remember the story I keep giving you about the Chinese currency and what they're doing, or what they have historically done?
I like
Is that like,
have it equal with like the US dollar.
Yeah, so what they did was so it wasn't equal to, it was tacked below it. So what happened is Chinese yuan, actually, Justin, did you have an answer too? Sorry, I should have let you answer.
yeah, I know like there were big allegations like in the midst of like the trade war that they were like artificially suppressing their value to like kind of get back at the US for the trade war.
Yeah, so that's a different topic. I'm gonna leave that one alone for right now. But it is related to this. So this is not allegations. This is what they have historically done. So China was a low income country and was considered low income, and they used those caveats in the rules. And so instead of having a flexible exchange system, they created a fixed rate exchange system. And they said that here's the US dollar, and we're always going to be, I don't know the exact amount, but we're always going to be fixed below that dollar. And so what happened is when you do that, it becomes cheaper to import from them, and basically it becomes cheaper to import, right? So it drives this relationship of importing. But what happens, and this is just my hands moving, what happens when you drive this import, eventually what happens is their currency appreciates. So then it becomes less cheap to import, and we start moving the flows the other way until you appreciate above it, and then the flows go backwards. The problem that people argue, and I think comes back to some of the frustrations for the trade war, which I'll tie something else in, is that when it tacked below it, it never allowed for the appreciation of the yuan to go above or to come up to the US dollar. And so it led to this imbalance of trade flows. It led to this imbalance of the relationship that we normally would see coming out of this relationship. And so one of the problems that happened was we took this to WTO, and we argued as the U.S. for a long time that China shouldn't be given this caveat that it does have super low income country, it does have super low income or impoverished people, but it also has this really developed area, and you're allowing them kind of to use the poor parts to kind of argue for the other parts, and that they shouldn't be allowed to have this fixed rate exchange system because it's creating these trade imbalances. And I think that some of that is what has led to some of the argument of the trade war that we had, was that, hey, this currency imbalance. And so, because normally the balance of trade occurs because these currencies start to equate to each other, right? Is that at some point, like as you buy more and more of my good, right? Like it becomes cheaper for me to buy the other way. And so that's an example of how a fixed rate exchange system can cause problems, and how we sometimes argue against that, or why we might want to do it a different way. That's all I'm gonna say. I mean, I've talked about this, I think, 1,000 times this semester, because it's like a good example, and it's one that I know. So the question might be, why do we care about these exchange rates, right? I mean, I feel like I made a compelling argument up until this point, but it might be that why have we, you know, what is the big deal? And part of the reason why we might care about it is because these exchange rates dictate or kind of influence how and what we're going to be able to consume globally, right? As the US dollar increases, it means it's cheaper to import goods. And so that means we're going to import a lot more goods that we might normally not have access to. Or we can do this for any country. Any country is the same. I'm just using the US because I'm American. I think about my country. So I only have like 3 more points, and then we can take our class break just for reference. So a rule of thumb is that rule of thumb is that appreciation raises the relative price of a country's exports and decreases the relative price of imports. So this, which is what we have talked about this, right? We're formalizing it right now, is that by these kind of currencies and how my currency is related to your currency, because everything is relative. It's the same way we talked about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is only important in that it's relative to 2 different countries, or 3 or 4, or how many countries we're going to compare it, is that we're comparing these countries, right? I can't have comparative advantage by myself. When we talk about currencies is only relative to how much it's going to purchase. And so when we think about exchange markets, right, it's only going to be relative to another country. And so when we think about appreciation, it's my currency kind of coming above, some value above, appreciating. It raises the relative price of my exports, because now my currency is worth more than yours. And so it costs you more to buy the same amount you bought before. And so what it does is it makes my exports more expensive, but it makes your imports cheaper. And so as I appreciate, I'm going to import more from you. But as I import more from you, your currency appreciates, right? And so this is going back to that Chinese example where it didn't have that balance happening because their currency could never appreciate to the point in which that balance occurred. And so, I'm just going to read these. I don't have to write them out. Given depreciation of a currency, so given that your currency goes lower, right? Foreigners find your goods cheaper. They're going to import more. So when we talk about, is it good or bad to be devalued? And a lot of times people get really upset when, like, they'll say the US dollar gets devalued, and we get really upset because you're like, no, we want to have a good currency. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's a good thing to have a devalued currency, because that means more people are going to buy your products. So so let's think as an agricultural exporter, and if you're producing soybeans and the US dollar devalues, it is better for you, because that means more people are going to demand your product, because now they have the money to afford it, right? They're going to demand more of your product, which means you're going to sell more in relation to what you had before. And so there are ways in which you want to devalue your good. Now, you don't always want to be lower, right? Like there's a balance there. But there is some kind of effect of as you appreciate and depreciate, you change your imports and export flows. So this is all I'm going to say on this, but I will encourage you to understand how that flows work. So if you have any questions on that, we should talk about that now, because what I want you to be able to understand is appreciation leads to what? If you appreciate, what does it lead to? I'm going to tell you. So appreciation leads to fewer exports and more imports. Depreciation or devaluation of your currency leads to more exports and fewer imports.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so I'm only gonna go in one direction here, and then you can just flip it around in your notes. So appreciation leads to reduced exports and increased imports.
Okay.
And then you should take in your notes and flip it the other way. So devaluation flips it the direction.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Looking at countries in Asia, countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, these countries have the highest currencies in the world, and their currency are of less demand than dollars and euro. So what could be responsible for that?
I'm gonna go on a limb here. So specifically, Kuwait produces a lot of oil, and so they're going to be demanding. So we're going to demand the currency to buy their oil from them. That's going to be what that's. And again, I'm just shooting from the hip here. I'm going to guess that a lot of those countries whose major export are going to be oil, and oil is going to be a specific case where these relationships aren't totally going to work because they have monopoly power, and so. That's related to a second topic, but your specific question was, why does Kuwait have such a high currency value? And it's going to be because of its oil demand.
Yes.
My guess.
Yeah.
So are there any other questions about understanding this relationship between appreciation and exports and imports, or depreciation and its relationship between exports and imports? Nice. Take your silence as saying that you are good. So do you want to have a quick break? Okay, let's have a quick break and then we can chat about, yeah, okay. Everybody, we'll have our classroom break. What was I had crazy news? Does anybody have crazy news you want to talk about? Nobody has crazy news. I have a rousing question for everybody. So this is because it's going on in the media right now, and I was curious. I mean, I know what I think. There's this debate coming out right now that is going to be state power versus federal power. President Trump has come out and said that he has total authority to establish whether lockdowns are on or off. And the state governors are saying, wait a minute, I have autonomy over my state and I can make those decisions. And again, it comes back to this, regardless of your political spectrum, I don't care what side you're on. I think it'll be an interesting play, because arguably federal law can supersede state law, but federal law can't interfere with state law. So like there's a point where as a federal law comes in and says, like, from a perspective, it says the state, does or doesn't have a lockdown, the federal law can say you have a lockdown now, and the federal can take off their federal lockdown. But if the state has a lockdown and the federal comes on caps and uncaps, you still have a state lockdown. And so it'll be an interesting play, I think, out between President Trump and the state governors and the autonomy of their state rights. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that? Nope. come up with other crazy news. I feel like y'all aren't really chatty with me today. Just a
This
little
isn't
bit.
really crazy news, but it was something that I appreciated last night.
Yeah.
It was like a news station in Memphis was trying to tweet out like an article about like it was like a super serious article. Like the tweet body said something along the lines of like multiple workers at a local nursing facility like diagnosed with COVID-19. But for some reason, the link that they included with the tweet was a link to like the Popeyes fried chicken sandwich coming out. And so it was like this super serious tweet about coronavirus, but the link to the article was like, you've got to try this new Popeyes chicken sandwich. And it was just a really great moment in time for me to see this tweet come out.
No, that's hilarious because like you imagine like was that like somebody accidentally whoops-a-daisied it and like put the wrong link in there, or was it like an ad that was like prior to the like was it the link was literally just to this Popeyes thing?
Yeah, it was literally just a link to like an
that's-
article they had published like a few weeks back when the chicken sandwich came out. I don't know what they were doing, but it's just really sad to see this super serious like coronavirus
Tweet
news
and-
update with
yeah.
the Popeyes chicken sandwich.
That's really funny. I almost thought you were going to say that they accidentally rickrolled everybody. It could also have been. I mean, almost. It's basically the same thing, right? Like, but yeah, some kind of That's really funny. There's this. I saw it on Facebook, and it was this comedian who it was. She basically said, "I'm 4 months in the future," and she talked to her January self, and was talking about. Like, hey, do you want the good news or the bad news? And you know, and it's quite funny. I liked it. I shared it because I thought it was funny, and I thought we needed some levity. But it was the lady was like the good news, and she was like, oh, it's never been better for climate change, and she was like, oh, that's great, like that's wonderful. And she was like, and they were like, what's the bad news? And she's like, you should pull all your money out of the stock market right now, like in January. And she's like, and maybe you should just go ahead and do a Costco run, you know, just in case. And it was going through all these things, and the lady was like, oh, well, you know, these wildfires, the Australian wildfires, are really going to define 2020, and that the future her is like, you would think that was what was going to define this, but it doesn't. And I just thought it was so funny about how this idea of like, if you could have talked to yourself 4 months ago and been like, the world is going to be crazy, you're going to stay at home for a month and a half, and you'd be like, that's crazy, nobody would ever do that. And then bam, here we are. Yeah, anyways, I'm going to go answer Nate on the chatty thing. Actually, I'm not. I'm just going to tell Nate. I saw your response, Nate, to that, like the government staying out of this. It could. I think that's always an argument about like whether it strains relationships between the states and the federal government. I think the concern right now has been that coming up is the federal government taking up supplies that like the state governments need, and so there's been that kind of battle between those. And I think that in hindsight, I think President Trump will wish he hadn't have try to do that, because I think that there's this little bit of this struggle between like you need the states to like the federal government only exists because the states also support the federal government, right? And so there has to be this relationship. There's a symbiosis between those two, and I think that that because the argument that President Trump said and then has continued to stand by was that, you know, that the states need to play ball with him in order to get the supplies. And you're like, I don't think that, you know, and I think that will eventually have bad optics for him. This is that like, hey, you weren't willing to support these states because you're mad at us. You know, I mean, I don't think that's the way you want to do that. But I do think that kind of ultimate say on that, you know, I agree that there's a point where if the states want to have a policy, they can have it.
Yeah, I think what I was originally thinking was I don't know if this is true or not, but I saw a while ago that Kentucky was closing the border to Tennessee because they said that Tennessee's policies were way too lax on how we were approaching everything. And so just like expanding that beyond just like Tennessee and Kentucky, like if someone like New York is struggling a lot, but they're trying really hard, and like just for example, like New Hampshire or Vermont, like, you know, is not giving much effort to it. I don't know if this is true or not, but like in the future, if that was the case, and then like it's like 3 months from now, and the national government, like an effort to save face, is like, oh, everything's great, just go wherever you want, and then like Vermont comes and like restarts the whole thing in Tennessee, in New York or something like that.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. I mean, New York is in such a bad state right now. So
No, I mean, I think that you raise, again, super interesting question, because it comes back to that, like what do we call it? Like an economic union. Because I mean, that's effectively what the if we boil it down, the U.S. is kind of a type of economic union. I mean, now we consider us all one country, but like we arguably still have individual states, and maybe the same way that I hadn't been thinking about it like that, but this idea that like once we as states start, because we're competing against one another, which is the problem, is you don't want states to start competing, right? Like we don't want Kentucky and Tennessee to having to compete for resources or other things. But what happens if we start this competition so that after the fact, after the coronavirus, is that like, hey, we're not gonna, we're gonna shut the border so Tennesseans can't come to Kentucky. It's like, well, but that's not the free flow of goods and products and people, right? And it's like, I don't, as a U.S. citizen, I think I should have the right to go anywhere in the U.S. And maybe right now that might be limited because of the disease, but I wonder how that'll play out afterwards. That's a good point, Nathan, to think about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll see what happens with Texas, because Texas is saying like they're going to start opening things up relatively soon. So like, what kind of effects that has on everyone? I mean, Texas is huge. Like that's I don't know.
I think we have a lot of natural experiments happening. And I read this, it was an article, and it was talking about Kentucky and Tennessee, and it was talking about how there's similar demographics. And even if you take account for like population size, but it's like a different approach that they took to this. And then it was like showed like the raising number, the number of cases that were happening in the two different states, and like the number of death rates and things. And it was kind of saying like, sadly, like this natural experiment's happening about like how you approach the topic and how, what kind of policies you're creating. And so I don't know, it'll be some crazy stuff. That's what's happening. It's crazy.
Yeah.
As a Kentuckian and a Tennessean, I would like to say that the border isn't technically closed. They've been, basically what it is Kentucky's like really encouraging people who live on the Tennessee side to not go back and forth anymore and just stay home. And there have been some instances where people are like getting escorted back to their homes, but it's only happened like once or twice, and only in certain counties that have like more intense lockdowns in place. And those are the ones that are like on the border with Tennessee.
Like escorted home, like, you, sir, are gonna go home right now. Let me take you.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Christina, do you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I guess it was Friday, it was Thursday. I went from West Virginia back to Knoxville, and so I had to go through through Kentucky, and like I didn't get pulled over or anything, but I was like scared to death I would the whole time. But there was like a ton of state troopers everywhere, so but there wasn't that many people on the road. But
I suppose it's a good thing. It'll be sorry, we're going to keep talking about coronavirus, and our break is up, and we'll finish talking about class stuff. But I think it'll be, I read this article, and it was this person who was like, oh, an alternative view. And this guy was like, oh, the disease is never going to go away if we're all locked down. And it's like, yeah, but the problem, we're not locking down to get rid of the disease. We're locking down so that if you get sick, or or when you get sick, or if somebody gets, that we will have enough ventilators so that you don't die, or you have the best chance of living, right? Like this isn't about stopping the disease, it's stopping the spread of it, limiting that spread so that we kind of flatten that curve. And I think that was just being aware of like what the purpose of this isn't, so that nobody gets it. Its purpose is that we have a better chance of all being okay. So, which I would like none of you to get it or get sick. Okay, let's go back to class. We're gonna kind of one final thing on this exchange rates. There's this phenomena, and it's called the J-curve effect. I know we're just jumping right back in. The J-curve effect, and this is the concern that people have, and that happens because what we just said was, we said this kind of movement of exports and imports based on appreciation and depreciation of your currency. The J-curve effect is this phenomenon, which phenomena, here, I'll just spell it out. Phenomenon, in which following devaluation, countries often experience a worsening of their trade balance prior to an improvement. So I'm gonna reread that. It's a phenomenon in which following a devaluation, countries often experience a worsening of their trade balance prior to an improvement. So the idea is, hey, right, like I was above you, so I was importing a lot from you, and then all of a sudden my currency devalued, and they're saying there's this weird thing that happens, that even though I devalued, I'm still importing a lot of things from you before it changes and I switch back the other way, right? So before there's an improvement. It's all really small. Does anybody need me to read that one more time? I'll read it one more time. Phenomena in which following devaluation, countries often experience a worsening of their trade balance prior to an improvement. So before we improve, there's this weird thing that happens where we have an even worse trade balance and then it improves. And they said that in reading about this, to teach you all, it was like they see it's this weird phenomenon that happens all the time. That like that we know these relationships exist. We know that devaluation leads to increase in exports over a period of time. But there's this period of time immediately following devaluation that it takes before it switches the other way. And we could think about this as kind of this psychological lag. That there's this lag in how we're importing and exporting. And there's a psychological lag that happens where between the point where we said, oh, it's logical to switch who's exporting to who, and the time where we actually switch, it takes us a minute to catch up. It takes our brains a little bit to catch up. And so we continue to trade in the ways we had before we switch it around and do the other way. And I think it's probably a little bit of that, like, hey, we need to click this car in reverse, but I'm still rolling forward for a little bit. And we have to stop that momentum and then shift it into reverse before we flip back the other way. And that's my funky redneck version of an example here. And so, so a lot of times, so sometimes, and I imagine this would happen, is if all of a sudden your currency devalued and everybody's like, well, see, we don't see the improvement in our trade, and they get really upset about it. Legitimately, because they've been told that they should be improving trade, and it's like, but there's a psychological lag that happens. And so I don't think I had any links or anything to send you, but it's a thing that exists, and it will be an interesting case about how people relate to trade given this J-curve effect. And if we're looking only in the immediate after effect of devaluation, or if we allow it to have time into figuring out at what point do we see that flip happen. And I've never studied it, so I don't actually know how long that takes. Let me see how many more notes I have, because I can start going into foreign direct investment, and then we have balance of trade. It takes longer in these online classes to go cover material, I think. I hate to always let you out early. I know you're like, no, we're great. Let's get out of here. We basically are going to start a new topic. We're going to start on foreign direct investments. Let's just stop here. And then we can cover foreign direct investments next class, and then hopefully finish up with balance of trade. And then we can get into current events for the final push of the semester. So let me, I'll leave that up in case anybody still needs it. So so we'll just have class on Thursday like normal. I hope you all enjoyed your long weekend, and if you have any questions, obviously stay on and let me know. I'm gonna stop sharing now. you have any questions, stay on, let me know. It's lovely to see your faces or hear your voices. Thanks for participating and have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, see you, Sahid.
Dr. Thompson?
Yes, Olivia.
I did have a quick question. For
Always.
my paper,
You talk
I
to me
was
about all the
looking-
things. I'm just keep interrupting you because I'm being funny. Let me stop recording.